I keep talking sometimes about quadratics and sometimes about parabolas, which is the shape. Sometimes it's easier to understand it if you look at the graph, if you look at the shape of a parabola. And that's an easier way to understand the question. This question says find the y-intercept for y equals x plus 1 times x minus 4. To visualize this, let's graph it. I'm going to go to desmos.com, which is a really cool calculator. There we go. And I'm going to go on the graphing calculator. And I'm going to graph this equation. Y equals x plus 1, x minus 4. Cool. So this is the graph. And there are some points where the graph is 0. There's one here, you can see, at about -1. And there's another point where it's 0 up here, where the y is 0. And that's about 4. So these are the points where it crosses the x-axis, which is this one here. So those are the x-intercepts. Isn't it strange that these x-intercepts have a y value of 0? That's odd, isn't it? X-intercept has a y value of 0. There is only one point that crosses the y-axis. This axis here. There's only one point that crosses this. And at that point, x is 0. Doesn't that seem backwards? That for the y-intercept, the x is 0? I guess that's just how it is. For the y, to cross the y-axis, x has to be 0. So, where'd these questions come from? Those aren't the ones that we were just looking at. We just had a different formula, didn't we? And it wasn't these ones either. Well, that's okay. We can skip right past them. So if it's a y-intercept, x is 0. And I would highly encourage you, if you see the word y-intercept, write x equals 0. Makes life a lot easier. So that means if we know that x is 0 for a y-intercept, we can replace x with 0. So I'm going to write exactly the same thing, but instead of x, replace it with 0. Cool. So y equals 0 plus 1 in brackets times 0 take 4 in brackets. Well, what's 0 plus 1? 1. And what's 0 take 4? -4. 1 times -4. Positive times a negative is a negative. 1 times 4 is 4. Y equals -4. And our graph checks out. That's where it crosses the y-axis. Neato. Let's try another one. Let's try to find it for this quadratic. Y equals 2x squared minus 4x plus 2. I'm going to put that in another one. Y equals, what was it? 2x squared minus 4x plus 2. So if we want to find the y-intercept, that's where it crosses the y-axis. And for all these points, x is 0. So we're looking for a point where x is 0 and y is on this curve. So for a y-intercept, x is 0. So you should put a little reminder to yourself. Y-intercept, so x equals 0. Helps a lot. Y-intercept means that x is 0. All right. So I'm just going to write it a bit more spread out because on the next line, we're going to substitute. We're going to replace. So the y we don't know yet. So I'll just write by 2. This is 2. There's an invisible symbol between the 2 and the x. That's an invisible time sign. The x I replace with 0 and the squared is still there. The minus I can copy down. This means 4 times x. So 4 times 0. And the plus 2 I can copy down. There it is. Okay. So now, therefore, copy down. The y copy down. The equals copy down. 2 times 0 squared. Well, 0 squared is 0 times 0, which is 0. And that times anything is going to be 0. So that term's 0. And this term is also multiplied by 0, so that one is also 0. And this one is not multiplied by 0. I add a 2 once I'm done with all this mess. So I'll just copy that plus 2 down. Okay. So finally, y equals 0 minus 0, and then add 2. And the answer to that is 2. And that is exactly what we expected it to be. Cool. All right. Next one. Find the X intercepts. Well, if it's a Y-int, X is 0. I forgot to say down here, the Y-int is positive 2. Is a nice way to finish that question. Anyway, up here. Find the X intercepts. For an X intercept, Y has to be 0. Backwards, isn't it? For an X intercept, Y has to be 0. Write the same for yourself here. An X intercept, so Y equals 0. There we go. Already started that question. So let's replace Y with a 0. So this will look like 0 equals, and then all this mess, because I don't know what X is. Now, this is nicely factored, so we can use the Null Factor Law. We know that these two things multiplied together equals 0, so either the first one is 0 or the second one is 0. If this thing is 0, X has to be negative 1. What solution do you think would come from here? If X minus 4 is 0, then X has to be positive 4. So those are our X intercepts. You can write X int if you want to. That's a bit shorter. Let's check if that worked. That was this one. And sure enough, negative 1 and 4. So the system really does work. And it can be easier than graphing it. All right. So now let's find the X intercepts for this tricky one. Well, an X intercept means that Y is 0, because it's a bit backwards. So let's replace Y with 0. Everything else I'll just copy down. Now at first glance, this does look tricky to solve now. I can't use the sum and product thing yet, because I've got a number in the front here. But what I can do is take out a common factor. Can you see a common factor that goes into each of these terms? A number or a letter? It is a number. I'll tell you it's a number. That goes into each of these things. The number is 2. Each of these can be divided by 2. So let's write it as 2 times the 3 terms. This term here, the 2x squared, is 2 times x squared. You can divide this by 2 and get it. And this, I'll copy the negative down, but this is going to be 2 times, well, half of 4x is 2x. And sure enough, 2 times negative 2x is negative 4x. And finally, 2 times something gives positive 2. 2 times 1. So this last term is a positive 1. Well, now that it's we've got a common factor out, now we can use our sum and product. Can you think of two numbers that have a sum of negative 2, but a product of positive 1? The numbers are negative 1 and negative 1. If you do minus 1 and subtract 1, you get negative 2. But if you do minus 1 times minus 1, you get positive 1. So there is actually only one solution here. X minus 1 has to be 0, so X is minus 1. That's not true. X is positive 1. Because if X minus 1 is 0, X has to be positive 1. 1 take 1 will give me an answer of 0. So that's the answer. There is only one X intercept. When it says find the X intercepts, it's a little trick question, isn't it? Because there's only one. I'll show you what that looks like and why that's the case. I have this graph here. And apparently it only touches the X axis at one point. The graph looks like this. And look, it just touches right here at X equals 1. So that's why this one only had one solution, whereas this one has 2. And they all lived happily ever after.